Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Samurai Goddess. The goddess next door takes on kung fu killers in this action-packed martial arts Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Samurai Goddess in paperback and e-readers today. I had a chance to read Marvel's Unstoppable Wasp at the library over the last 2 days, and after reading Marvel's Unstoppable Wasp, I can honestly say it's one of the worst comics Marvel has ever produced in its nearly 80-year history. With Marvel's Unstoppable Wasp, there was a idea to go out here and make a heroine who would make science appealing to girls. Unfortunately, that concept falls apart due to the poor execution by the writer, who really doesn't understand whether he wants to write a traditional Marvel comic or if he wants to write a manga-style comic. And because your Unstoppable Wasp has a disjointed direction, the whole book just falls apart from the premise of the first issue. Now, in Marvel's Unstoppable Wasp first issue, there are numerous technical errors on the first page. And the first page of a first issue should really do three things. One, it should introduce us to the main character on the splash page. And the splash page is one single image of the character doing their thing and headed towards some sort of place to let us know who they are, what they want to do, and why we should care. And it's hard to see that from the first page of the first issue of The Unstoppable Wasp, because when you look at the first page of The Unstoppable Wasp, we get this first panel, which is an establishing shot of the city in the distance in a neighborhood, and that's not a strong way to open a first issue. Then it transitions to a close-up of Nadia Pym looking at some Pakistani donuts in a Pakistani bakery where she's hanging out with Kamala Khan, and we get this whole dialogue about donuts. That does not tell us who the main character is, what she wants to do, or why we should care to pay $3.99 for this comic to pick up this issue. So when you look at this first page, it does not give you that incentive to go out here and turn the page and continue reading the story. So this first page is a weak page, and it looks like, again, an attempt to try to sell a manga-style story in the Marvel Universe. However, the whole concept from the execution is all wrong. The reason why creators use a splash page is to show this character in action and then show them going somewhere so that the reader can turn the page and find out what they're going to do. Now, a stronger splash page would have been showing the Nadia Pym character in her costume flying down that city street and then showing her going somewhere, which was what they were trying to do, saying that she was going to buy these donuts before she went to the INS office to talk to the INS people about her citizenship. Now, again, stronger splash page would have shown her in her costume, flying towards the INS office, and then that would have set up the story to let us know who that main character was, what she wanted to do, and we would have had a reason to care. We would have gotten into this story in less than 3 pages, and that would have given the reader a reason to start to see why this character would be called the Unstoppable Wasp. But from the way it was executed, we don't get to see that. Instead, what we get is a whole bunch of scenes with her talking about donuts and food, and then going to the INS office. And that segues into a fight where Mockingbird is having a fight with a big robot, and then as Mockingbird is having this fight with this big robot, the Wasp comes in to help. And again, that's not a really strong setup. It doesn't make the character appear compelling, and it really makes the heroine a background character in her own story. Instead of the character being actively involved, she's looking passively involved. And when you have a story that features a heroine, you want the heroine to be front and center in her own story. That's what you want in a good story, is you want the heroine front and center taking on the villain. But in this book, she's passively towards the side, and Mockingbird is in the center, and then she comes in to help. And that's not what you want in a first issue. In a first issue, you want that showcase of the main character doing their thing. And that's the big problem with Unstoppable Wasp, where it just does not have that setup so that the character appears strong, appears compelling, and grabs that reader and makes them interested in the character. Now, the other problem with the Nadia Pym character is that she just doesn't have a really solid personality. And that's another big problem that I've seen with a lot of heroines in a lot of comics, is that they don't really set up with a strong personality or a strong voice. So that makes it next to impossible for the reader to identify with the character or relate to the character, their story, or their experiences in the story. Because as I was reading this Unstoppable Wasp and we got into this battle, I did not see anything that would make me connect with this character. This character is just so one-dimensional. She just comes across as flat, and then the way she speaks and doesn't sound like any sort of 16-year-old teenage girl. So I don't see anybody that I would know or anybody I would want to be a friend with in this story. And when you have a superhero comic, this character has to be someone everybody can relate to, everybody can see their experiences in, and someone with a voice that speaks to the reader. And when I read your Nadia Pym's dialogue, it just came across as bland, very generic, and it just did not really come off the page to really speak to the reader. And when she comes in talking about science, she just comes in, it's not organic, it's not coming across as really interesting, it just comes across as something that's like forced in, like one of those comic books you would get from the cereal box, or one of those comic books you would get at school from the health class. That's what a lot of her dialogue really came across as related to science. Now, I know many people want to get girls interested in science, but when I read Unstoppable Wasp, I don't see anything that really makes a girl want to be interested in science. What I see with the concept for Unstoppable Wasp is Marvel trying way too hard to make this character promote science to girls, and with the heavy-handed approach, all that does is alienate girls from seeing how science can be compelling and interesting. Now, I've written stories where I have applied science to characters like the ISIS series, and in 3 ISIS series books and 1 E-Steam series book, I show how to make science appear to be fun and compelling to girls. And in one of the first books I wrote, where I was working on the whole concept of making science interesting for girls, I applied approaches that I knew that girls would like, and this was a story called Isis the Beauty Myth. And in Isis the Beauty Myth, I went and took the Isis character and I had her going shopping at this sepia store, which was inspired by Sephora, and they're going to this store, Sepia, and they're talking about buying cosmetics, and it all transitions into the bad guy who is using spyware in her computer apparatus to figure out how to reverse the aging process. So I take science and I make it interesting because I'm talking about things that women usually use, which is cosmetics, and there's a science behind cosmetics, and this is something that usually most girls like, and this is why the ISIS series book, The Beauty Myth, was really, a lot of girls liked it because I talk about science in a way that's appealing to girls. I talk about the cosmetics industry, and I talk about the science as related to cosmetics, and I also talk about self-image, body image, and self-worth in the story of Isis, the Beauty Myth. And in another Isis series story, the follow up to Isis, the beauty myth, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, I also talk about girls in science. And in that story, I show how the Rahima character who runs the Sepia Corporation becomes obsessed with Isis's beauty as a goddess and decides to turn herself into the cyber goddess using the nanocell technology she has created in her own laboratory. So the character goes from being a cosmetic scientist to a mad scientist, and she uses that science in a way to turn herself into the cyber goddess and goes to take on the Isis character. And that was one of the things that leads to the building of the relationship and the rivalry between Isis and the cyber goddess in those two stories. And in both of those stories, I show how you can use science and make it appealing to girls without being heavy-handed. The way I execute the concept is to take the science concept and make it something fit organically within the story and make it something that's relatable to girls and things that they use in their everyday lives, because there is a science to cosmetics and there is a science to beauty products, and I use it in a way, again, that makes it appealing to the everyday girl and the everyday woman. And because I make it appealing to the everyday girl and the everyday woman and something that they see science as something in their everyday life. And a good comic book writer wants to make those concepts, yes, they use comic book style ideas, but they make it where it's applied to everyday life. Now, there's another story that I wrote in the Isis series called Samurai Goddess, where I also use science. And in that story, I have Isis taking on these kung fu killers who they call the manga girls, and they're trying to kill this girl who has created this fusion cell battery. And again, I use science, but I also go in here and I give you that action and adventure story. Now, there's another story I did applying science, but this one was a little different. This was an E-Steam series story called E-Steam Fairy Tale. And in Fairy Tale, I take a jab at the modern day fairy tale, but I also use some concepts from science in that story as well. Now, in this story, you have E-Steam taking on Morgan Le Fay, who has put John Haynes to sleep, and she has to go and try to take on Morgan Le Fay in order to get her boyfriend back awake again. And it's sort of like a jab at Sleeping Beauty, but in the story, I talk about magic, which is the predecessor to science, and I also talk about alchemy, which is the predecessor to chemistry. And again, when you understand how to use these concepts, you can fit them organically into the story, and you can make it a part of the story in an entertaining fashion. Unfortunately, with the Unstoppable Wasp, the big problem is that the stories are so heavy-handed towards science that everything just comes across as preachy and everything comes across as forced. And the action sequences in the story, they really suffer as a result of this heavy-handedness, because instead of us seeing her try to use her intelligence to solve problems and overcome the bad guy, we see her just really condescending to the reader. And that's another big problem, with the Unstoppable Wasp, is that this Nadia character just comes across as obnoxious and condescending, and she talks down to the reader, and you don't want your heroine talking down to the reader. The hero, again, needs to be a friend to the reader. The hero needs to be someone we can relate to, someone we can identify with, someone we care about, and someone we feel is a friend. And when I look at Nadia Pym, she does not come across as someone anyone would want to be friends with. She just comes across as really narcissistic, really selfish in her own world, and really does not see people as people. She comes across as very disconnected from everyone, and that again makes her stories very hard to read because instead of me relating to this character, I became very indifferent to this character, and I became very indifferent to this character due to the way she was written, and that really hampered her mission as a character because this character calls herself the Unstoppable Wasp, and I don't see anything that makes her unstoppable. I mean, if you're going to call this character unstoppable, you have to show me how she has this grit, how she has this determination, and how she overcomes challenges. And that's another big problem with this Nadia Pym character is that she just doesn't have any major serious challenges to take on. And this fits within the paradigm for many of these comic book heroines is that they never really give them any sort of compelling challenge. And I looked at the first issue, and instead of her coming up with a solution to problems, that comes out organically from her years of so-called being a scientist, we get Ms. Marvel helping her out. We get Mockingbird helping her out. We don't get to see her at front and center solving a problem or overcoming an obstacle. Part of a superhero comic or a story is showing the hero overcoming the obstacles in front of them. That's the major part of a comic is seeing that hero overcome the challenges placed in front of them and showing us a person who learns from the lessons as they're overcoming their obstacles. I didn't see that with Unstoppable Wasp. I didn't see how this character had some sort of unstoppable grit, unstoppable determination, and a unstoppable courage to overcome the challenges put in front of her. What I saw in the first issue was a character who was a selfish, narcissistic, obnoxious person who wouldn't give me an incentive to spend $3.99 on the next issue because after they beat the woman in the big robot as they're talking about the science, they then go to a restaurant after eating donuts from the Pakistani donut place to another diner to eat more food. And that was another annoying thing about this book is that there's just so much eating. I mean, do people I know people eat 3 meals a day and they have snacks, but in some of these issues, it just every issue had so much food in it, it just wasn't funny. I know that it just was annoying to me to see all that food in that book. I wanted to see action and adventure, and I didn't get to see much action and adventure. What I saw was people dumbing down the comic book paradigm and the story model to try to make it appealing to girls and trying way too hard because as I read each issue of Unstoppable Wasp, I just again did not see a very compelling story as related to this Nadia Pym character and why I should care about this Nadia Pym character. I did not see anything as related to a character transformation arc, and I did not see her having relationships with any of the characters in the story. Because after she goes out and her and Mockingbird and Ms. Marvel beat this woman in the big robot, she then talks about starting her girl campaign and then goes to recruit teenagers to be part of her Burger King Kids Club. And that's not what I'm paying money to go read a comic featuring a heroine about. Now, when I was doing the ISIS series, I always made sure that ISIS always had a bad guy to take on, a challenge to overcome, and an obstacle to face. But with this Unstoppable Wasp, we don't get to see her overcoming any sort of obstacles, taking on any sort of challenges, facing any sort of real conflict, or solving any sort of problems on her own. Everything is about her recruiting girls for her girl campaign and pushing all sorts of girl power, but none of these characters really come together in a way where they form actual friendships or relationships with each other in an organic fashion. We never get to see Nadia connect with these people. We just see her recruiting them for her campaign and her nonprofit, but we don't get to see her really meeting these people organically in an organic fashion. I would have, if I were writing this series, I would have it where she's taking on different bad guys, and then she's meeting these different people, and as they meet to come together, she's starting to talk about what she wants to do, and it all comes together organically. But the way it's executed here, she recruits all of these so-called smart girls, and then you have Janet Van Dyne coming in like a deus ex machina after the issue with the bomb in her best friend's head's issue, and she does everything for her. That's not what I would want to see in a story featuring a heroine, because that's not a strong character transformation arc for that character. What I want to see with a character like this is her running into obstacles with her citizenship, running into obstacles as she's taking on these bad guys, and running into obstacles as she's trying to make friends in a new country. And we didn't get to see any of that due to the poor one-dimensional writing in this series. The writing in this series is one of the things that prevents it from being a good series. There, with this character, and again, this writing is so terrible, and this character is so terrible, it takes a concept and it makes it literally what I call the unreadable Wasp, because it's all about this Nadia Pym character, it's all about her ego, and it's not about her looking to serve the community. Now, when it comes down to superheroes, they're supposed to be people who are looking to serve the community. They're supposed to be people looking to help out the community. And along the way, if they get to do some of the things they want to do, that's nice. I mean, I remember reading old Spider-Man comics, and Spider-Man, Peter Parker, was very interested in science. However, he understood with his great powers, he had a greater responsibility to serving those in the community. And that's one of the big problems with Unstoppable Wasp, is that her mission is fundamentally flawed. We don't get to see her showing unstoppable grit, unstoppable drive, unstoppable determination as she overcomes obstacles. It's all about just preaching heavy-handed girls need science, but not giving us any sort of story that features substance that makes this character appear to be someone we can relate to, someone we can identify with, and someone we can care about as a person. When it comes down to this Nadia Pym, or Van Dyne as she's called later on, because she emasculates Henry Pym by taking his wife's last name, we don't get to see how this character is someone we could like or we could root for. Everything is about her just telling us who she is and not showing us how she's a great character. I wanted to see this Nadia Pym character show how great she was and show how she was unstoppable, but she did not show me anything in the pages of this whole run that would make me say I would want to go out here and pick up this series or even recommend this series to girls. And I didn't see any sort of character development whatsoever with this Nadia Pym character that would make me say this is a great character. All I saw again was heavy-handed preaching talking about girls need science, but I didn't see anything that related to how girls would apply science in their everyday lives. Now, when I went out here and I wrote books like Isis, the Beauty Myth, I always looked to see how to make the story compelling to girls, to show them how they use science in their everyday life, because I knew that cosmetics are something that girls use every day, and cosmetics have a science behind them. And then in the second story, Isis, Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, I went into the mad science of comic books, and I drew inspiration from Wonder Woman's Dr. Cyber as a way to further make the story more compelling. I knew how to make science interesting, but I also knew how to bring in the science fiction elements to make the story compelling, and I also knew how to build the relationship between Isis and Rahima Sanders to show how these two characters were diametrically opposed to each other and how their philosophies worked against each other. And that formed for a very strong and dynamic relationship where these characters were adversaries, and it made for a far more compelling story. And I also did this in Samurai Goddess, where I use martial arts, and I also come in and talk about science. But I tell a compelling story where the reader gets to see the action and adventure in the opening scene, and that leads into the mystery regarding the fusion cell later on in the story. And I also talk about the relationships there. Again, Isis forming a friendship with the Misaka character, and her looking to be a protector like she was back in ancient Japan, where she was a samurai, and there were female samurais, and that's another thing I wanted to talk about in that story, and her continuing on with her Golden Lotus legend. So I went into the story, but I gave people a lot of layers, I gave them a lot of depth, and I gave them some complexity so that when they read the story, they could connect to the characters, they could relate to the characters, and they could relate to the experiences of the characters, and that made the story an entertaining one for the reader. And I also did this with Eastern Fairy Tale, where I talked about science again, because alchemy is the predecessor to chemistry, and I did that with the Morgan Le Fay character, who has gone on to become this business owner who owns this snack company. And again, chemistry is used in cooking. Chemistry was also a part of alchemy. So I tie it all together in all the stories so that the reader can see science, and they see science applied in their everyday life. And that's the thing that gets kids excited about science, is seeing how it's used in their everyday lives. With Unstoppable Wasp, we don't get to see how science is used in a character's everyday life or a person's everyday life, and we don't get to see how it's applied in a person's everyday life. We get preached that girls need to get into science, need to get into STEM, but we don't get to see them using everyday science in their everyday lives. And that's where the Unstoppable Wasp really fails, because it's supposed to be this story that gets kids into science, but it fails because it just spends so much time preaching at the reader instead of trying to tell them a compelling story that will give them a reason to go out here and learn more about things. I learned more about science from a Spider-Man comic than I would from the Unstoppable Wasp. That's how bad this comic is, and it's what's sad is that Marvel could have done something very compelling if they understood how to execute on the concept. And that's really the saddest thing about this Unstoppable Wasp, was that they just did not know how to execute on concept, because there was a way to make this character a compelling character. There was a way to make this character an interesting character, but because the writer they hired just did not know how to tell a story and went with this very flat and one-dimensional story, the whole series just fell apart in the first issue. And as we go through the 8 issues, we really don't see anything there that makes us care, because it's all about the Flash as related to test science, but it's not about the substance of telling a compelling comic book story. If you want to try the Isis series books I have mentioned, Isis the Beauty Myth, Isis Wrath of the Cyber Goddess, and Isis Samurai Goddess, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to pick up the digital version of Eastern Fairy Tale, you may do so by clicking the link to Smashwords.com in the description box. I believe that these stories would be far more compelling than what you read in Unstoppable Wasp, and I believe I can execute the concept a lot better than what you saw in Unstoppable Wasp. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.